But a quick review so far is, remember, we have the Anglo-Saxon Jewett migration, right?
Yes.
I know it's Monday morning, but we got to giddy up for the learning. Yep. After that, and these are the major milestones that's leading us to the four Liberty documents, right? Yes. All right. Make sure we're on the same page here. We had the Battle of Hastings in 1066. There we have William I, also known as William the Conqueror, who comes through from Normandy, France, what we would call Normandy, France today. He is actually only the king of the Normandy Kingdom. He defeats the Anglo-Saxons, consolidates his power, but keeps most of the administrative features of the Anglo-Saxons. That's kind of where we get the shires, the sheriffs, who, of course, he appoints. And he who appoints becomes the king's man, right? So, I'm actually missing it. No, here we are, right here. William I. That's William I. He has a son, William II. He's not liked very much. Why? What is the phrase you need to remember that he is accused of that our first Liberty document is supposed to address? Say it again. What he was doing was evil and oppressive. What was he doing that the people and his brother signed? Doesn't mean he necessarily agreed with it.
Oppressive rule over taxation and corruption.
There you go. That was what was considered evil and oppressive then. Over taxation, political corruption, that's what we would call it today. And the last one, Brett?
Oppressive rule.
Oppressive rule. Through a series of unfortunate events, suspicious events, he ends up getting killed during a hunting accident. Some think that possibly his brother had something to do with it. His brother, Henry I, becomes king, and he wants to gain some favor from the barons, from the church leadership, plus he was more or less forced to do it. He agrees to 1100 Charter of Liberties, what we call the 1100 Charter of Liberties, our first Liberty document. What were the key provisions in the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Should be in your notes.
Charter of Liberties. Oh, the lead church alone. I got that.
Yep. No influence with the church. In other words, he doesn't get to pick the bishops. He doesn't get to pick the church leadership or tell them what to teach. What else? Critical factor.
Oh, it gives guarantees rights to the common citizen?
Not necessarily the common citizen, to the barons, to the landowners.
So it states rights.
No, not in the way that we understand it today.
Well, it's like it's stating rights for people.
Okay, now that's a much better way to say it. Establishes a rule of law that not only are the barons held to, but so is the king and his men. Keep in mind, during this time period, in fact, this is how it's been even up into the 1800s, even in this country, the tax collector was required to collect a certain amount. Anything he could shake out of you above and beyond that was his. So if you're only required to pay 10%, if he could force you any way he can to pay 15%, he got to keep the 5 additional. That's how he got paid. Not necessarily legal, but allowed. Well, part of what they are fighting against is this kind of behavior. So the king's men could also go and commit rape and murder and steal and do it under the king's name and be totally exempt from any prosecution. One of the elements in the Charter of Liberties that you need to remember is it makes everybody subject to the law equally. Now, keep in mind, the king is not voluntarily signing this document, and he doesn't really follow much of it. But it does establish the ideal of liberty in the people's minds. And when we say people, we don't mean the peasants. Probably you and I. Okay? We're talking about the landowners, the barons. Okay? There is a huge class system in this time period. So when we're talking about different liberties and such, we're not necessarily talking about the dirt farmers. Okay? It will eventually spill over to them, but not for some time yet. Anybody remember King John?
Yeah, from Robin Hood.
From Robin Hood. That's right, the Robin Hood story. Yep. And last year I played the little cartoon from, I think it's Disney that made it, about Robin Hood, and where you got, I think it's the tiger who plays King John, and he has this little song, taxes, taxes, beautiful taxes. I was going to play that, but I forgot about it. So, but he loves taxes, as most government officials do. And he sends out his sheriff to go collect taxes. Okay, and the story goes with the Robin Hood story is that Robin Hood, not the Disney version, anti-capitalist version, but the original version is he would go and take the money, because the sheriff would come into a town, collect all the gold, silver, whatever of value, and then he'd go on down to the next town. Well, Robin Hood would go and catch him on the road, took it from. Okay, the Disney story is he took from the rich, gave to the poor. Not true. He took what was already theirs. He took what was stolen from them and gave it back to them. That's the essence of the Robin Hood story. Now, during this time period, King John also wants to interfere with the church. He wants to appoint his own bishops. Remember, at this time it's still the Roman Catholic Church. Archbishop Stephen Langton knows his history. And he pulls out the 1100 Charter of Liberties and reminds the barons, what are you doing letting him dictate to you like this? You have English rights. You have rights that you have inherited. And the king has agreed to this. When one king signs a document, he is committing all other kings after him to that commitment. Just like governments today. When a government signs a treaty, let's say the President of the United States negotiates a treaty and the Senate confirms that treaty, they have committed all other presidents after that, all other senates, all the American people after that to that treaty. For example, if Japan is ever attacked by China, we signed an agreement after we defeated Japan in World War II that in exchange of them never having a military again, we will provide their defense. That's why watching China and doing what they're doing in the South China Sea is very concerning to us. China and Japan do not get along. They've been enemies for centuries, maybe even thousands of years. If something happens, we will have to go to the defense of Japan. Same thing with the Western powers in Europe. The NATO alliance guarantees our intervention if Russia gets aggressive and comes into Western Europe. It was looking like we might have to do that when they invaded the Ukraine. There's a section in Ukraine Russia took over, and same thing in the Crimean down in the southern area over by the Black Sea. They invaded and what's called annexed, took over again. That could have easily triggered us in a response. That's why we still have troops over there. It's to help deter Russia's aggression. It's how we got into the Korean War. It's how we got into the Vietnam War. We had agreements that even though we may not want to go, we had an agreement and we were committed to go. Yes, that's why they didn't have the big uproar that the Ukraine had. Yeah, most Ukrainians did not want to be part of Russia again. Remember, millions of Ukrainians were starved to death in the mid-1900s because of Russia. So there's no love there at all. So.
Well, the problem is after all those Ukrainians starved, guess who moved in?
Russia.
Russians.
Yeah.
the whole eastern half is.
Yep. So the Archbishop says you have certain rights. Exercise them. Reinforce them. That leads us to the Magna Carta 1215, where at sword point, King John agrees to a list of rights, particularly in writing. What were the three main elements that we still use today? It's not that we don't use the others. Some of them are just no longer valid because of our system's a little different. But there are three provisions in particular that we still get today, that we still enjoy as part of our inheritance of being members of the Western civilization heritage.
Taxes can only be levied by the Parliament. Martial law may not be imposed in time of peace. Prisoners must be able to challenge their
Detentions, yep. So you get representative government. At this time, it's called Parliament. Parliamentary government. That's the same thing as representative government. We don't have a parliamentary system here, so we don't use that term. But in political philosophy, it is called parliamentary government. Representative government for the first time. That establishes the British Parliament. The second is no taxation without representation. That representation comes from where? Parliament. That's right. And the third is due process. You might get arrested, you could get arrested, but there is a process of which the court system had to operate. Prior to this time, they could arrest you for any reason. They don't like what you're wearing today. You can go to prison, and you didn't even know why. No trial, nothing. No way to challenge it. Couldn't see the evidence. Couldn't challenge the evidence, even if you did see it. There was no system for you to get what we'd call today a fair trial. Those are the three primary. I think there may be a couple others, but those are the three primary I want you to remember for this class. All right, so that is our first review. We left off after the Petition of Right of 1628 with the introduction of the English Civil War. No, we already covered that.
We were right after.
At the English Bill of the Glorious Revolution in the Bill of Rights. This fancy-looking guy is James II. And it's like the other kings leading up to this point. He's got multiple titles depending on who he's king over. At the same time, he is King James II and King James VII, King of England and King of Ireland.
Wait, this is after Charles.
After Charles II. Yep. He's also King of Scotland. He is the last Roman Catholic monarch in English history. That right there should tell you something. His theological background should tell you something how it's going to play out with Parliament, shouldn't it? Why? What do we know about Parliament by and large at this point?
Oh, they're Protestants.
Yes, thank you. Protestants. Very suspicious of anybody who is Catholic because of where their loyalties lie.
And the Pope.
In the Pope, yep. And keep in mind, this is still during a time period where if you were of the opposite religion of your king, you could easily be executed for it. Lots of Protestants in Europe are being murdered because they're not Catholic, and likewise, to a large degree, not to the same degree that the Protestants were persecuted, but the Catholics were as well. But by far, many more Protestants were killed by the Catholic armies than the Protestants. It is also this time period where in Europe, the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. It officially ended the 30 Years' War, which is the war that Martin Luther actually sparked with the Reformation. For 30 years, the Catholic armies from the different Catholic kings tried to squash out the Protestant movement, and some odd million or maybe 2 million Europeans were killed in this war. And the Treaty of Westphalia, which is still used today in many of its aspects. In fact, the origins of the United Nations come out of this. One of the provisions it provided for is whatever the religion of the king is at the time is the religion of the country. However, it's for the first time they acknowledge religious rights. You could practice your religion privately in your home if your belief system was different than the king's. Now that, again, like most everything else that we're going to see here, on paper that sounds good, but it was not practiced very well. And most certainly for our purposes, it was not practiced in England. You're going to see that at this time period as the Puritans, the Calvinists, starts getting persecuted and killed. That's how they end up coming here. We'll see that probably this week in a documentary. If not, it'll be early next week. Okay, you don't need to remember this detail. Just understand it's King James II. That's going to be the main figure in the Glorious Revolution. So I do need to talk about the Glorious Revolution a little bit. Because of his aggressiveness as being a Catholic and trying to reestablish a Catholic theological system over the Church of England. And I'm being very simplistic here. Please, most of what I'm talking to you about is very simplistic, only because I can't spend a whole quarter just teaching British history. So it's, as anything in the human condition, when you study human beings, it's never cut and dry. It's very complicated, but I'm trying to just narrow it down to give you just the not even the Reader's Digest version. But needless to say, Parliament had a conversation with the king and told him, unless you want to lose your head, here's what we want. He valued the connection between his head and his shoulders a little bit more than he did his rule. So he agreed to what's now called the English Bill of Rights. And the reason it's called the Glorious Revolution is because a new form of government, particularly how the government system, the monarch, addressed the people, totally changed. And it's glorious because no one died over it. They did not have to go to war to force it. So if somebody ever asks you, why is it called the Glorious Revolution? It's because they were able to have a governmental change without bloodshed. They didn't have to go to war. And again, I'm being very simplistic here for the purpose of this class. You could spend a lifetime studying this part of English history. And there are people that they dedicate their entire life to this time period. So the English Bill of Rights, the monarch would rule by consent of Parliament. Instead of having complete divine right, anything that the king wanted to have done would be done through consent of Parliament. He couldn't do anything, even still today. In fact, the king today, King and Queen of England, is so, I don't want to say watered down, that may be even too simplistic, but they are essentially just figureheads. Parliament makes all the decisions. Now, the king and queen, right now we only have a queen, but England only has a queen right now. But when they do get a king again, when she dies and Prince Philip becomes the king, what he wants has a lot of sway, but Parliament has no obligation to go with it. But at this time period, the Parliament has to agree with the king before an action would take place. So the provisions, you will want to write this down. The provisions of the English Bill of Rights asserts the nation's ancient rights and liberties. They are refining the language. These things existed in one way or another, but now they're consolidating language so it's very clear and precise. No taxation without consent of Parliament, period. If they have to reassert this provision when it was first written in 1215, what's that tell you about what's going on in history?
That they're taxing with still without.
That's right. The king still has this lust to dominate through taxation, which he always will. Every government official does. Once they realize there's unlimited spending, all they got to do is raise your taxes more. The right to petition the king for grievances. Let's say Parliament. You feel like Parliament has violated your rights. You have a right to address the king for his opinion on it. Nor quartering of troops during peacetime. We already know what's going on there, right? Sending troops into the homes to keep an eye on you at your expense. Looky here. That ideal is not an American ideal. The right to bear arms. Why would they need this in 1668? Why would they need a provision guaranteeing the right of the citizens to have a firearm in their home?
Because they're getting invaded.
Invaded by who?
The French.
Nope.
Oh wait, others.
Who's the others? This is a critical part for you to understand over this provision in our own law, too. Whose tyranny? The king. Not the deer. They're not worried about deer and elk uprising. It is the government that they are needing protection from. And what was happening is starting with King Charles I. Yes, we had firearms all the way back then. They were called matchlock rifles, muskets. The king would go in and confiscate the firearms away from the Protestants. So the Protestants could not defend themselves against the king's army, who was Catholic, who was trying to squash the Protestants and to enforce his taxation rules, though they were illegal. And a whole bunch of other things. The point here is they wanted to assure they had the capability to defend themselves equally against a tyrannical government. Freedom of speech. That's always an issue for governments, especially when you speak against them. When you expose their corruption, when you expose their illegal activities. It's also a problem, and we see that today, when somebody has something to say that you don't like. This provision is not to protect speech that we like. Speech that you like doesn't need protection. It is the speech you don't like, such as somebody who's got racist remarks. Facebook is a prime example right now. You want to get banned on Facebook, post too many conservative statements. And I'm not trying to play politics here, but that's what's really happening. And there's many conservative individuals, including senators, have been banned, or now what they're calling shadow banning, which I don't quite understand how that works.
It's where they ban you, but you can still post, but other people can't see.
But other people can't see. Yeah, that was my understanding. Because they're deeming, usually it's their computer system. It's not a live person who's making the decision. They have algorithms that if they're looking for keywords, that if they see that you're saying them, then it does happen more and more even now. I mean, Congress had to get involved here, was it last spring? Called Zuckerberg in and drilled them about what's going on at Facebook. Why are you censoring people? Now, and then we could get into the issue is it a public company, private company?
Well, it's a
Do they have a right to make decisions? Yeah.
It's also a public forum, so it can be argued that it's a public place of free speech.
That's right. That's the argument. Those who don't like the banning, that's the argument they make. Those who don't mind the conservative, because it's mostly conservatives that's getting banned. And then of course the white supremacists who, and quite frankly, I don't like what they got to say either. But here's the thing to remember, ladies and gentlemen. History has taught us this very clearly. When banning or book banning or those kind of things start, you two, there is no stop to it. That's the issue with this going on right now. It's the speech that we don't like is what needs protected. Because as soon as that is erased, as soon as that is banned, then there's no stopping the talk that you used to think is good or is okay. Good speech, well, speech we like, I should say, does not need protected. It is the speech we don't like. Excessive bail. We have a problem with this today. Excessive bail. The judges then, as well as today, will put a bail on you so you can't get out of jail. That was never the intent of this provision. Yes?
Well, but some people will pay bail and then just skip.
Yes, that is why there is a bail, is to help guarantee you will come back for court. The reason bail is important is that it's really hard to defend yourself and keep a roof over your head while you're sitting in jail. You go to jail and can't get out, you're going to lose your job. If you've got family at home waiting, they're going to go bankrupt. They're going to have to get a job. It's a life-destructing thing. So the idea of the bail, it was an insurance policy. It will be enough money, enough collateral is what it is, that you don't want to lose it by skipping out. But it was low enough where you could pay it and get out and defend yourself and keep your livelihood going. Nowadays, it's not uncommon to have $100,000, $500,000 bail on what seems to be not, especially for somebody who doesn't have the means to pay for it. If you don't have a house with collateral in the house, you can't even put your house up for a bail bondsman. So I see this a lot, and I'm like, that's a violation of our rights. But nobody's willing to do anything about it. I guess I'm not either, but just don't get in trouble. Don't break the law. But I see that a lot, a lot of people get nailed with this, with excessive bail. That's why you see in the news, the defense attorney asked for a reduced amount of bail. That's because the guy has no way of paying it, no way of getting collateral to make bail. And like I said, if you're in jail, you're going to very likely lose your home, your family. I don't know what people do. I just know that if you're not working and nowadays, if you're not set up to live on a one-income family, it takes two of you to run to pay for things, you're in a world of hurt. And then you're going to be stuck with not paying your attorney. You have to get public defender, which is subpar at best.
And they try to get you to say guilty.
Yes, that's why you see a lot of pleas, because it's cheaper to take a 5-year jail sentence than to spend millions of dollars trying to defend yourself. So you may end up the jury may find yourself innocent, but at what cost? If you're found innocent, you can't go to the government and ask for your money back. It's gone. There's no, hey, you prosecuted me wrongfully. You lose it all. So, cruel and unusual punishment. That's a big one. Still in once in a while in discussion today, particularly with our terrorist groups. When we used to capture them, we used to what's called waterboarding. Some people call that cruel and unusual, others don't. Some of the things they used to do, if you ever watched the History Channel, they had a couple programs on this, but they would put you in what's called a brass bull. It was basically a bronze casting of a bull. It was hollowed out inside, where they'd stuff you in, lock the bottom, and put a fire up underneath it. And as you cooked and screamed, then supposedly it sounded like a bull roaring as the noises were coming out of the bull's nose as you were cooked. A couple of other devices, they would put you in like a wheel with long spikes sticking through it, and as it turned, you're rolling around like you're in a dryer, and as you can imagine, you're being stuck like a pincushion until you die. So we even had such devices as trying to figure out whether you're a witch or not, Salem witch trial, tie you to like a big bucket kind of thing on a big pole and dump you into the river and hold you down there for a while and pick you back up, and if you didn't drown, you were a witch. If you drowned, that was your innocence. So we had our own fair share, and we still debate that today over capital punishment. It's lethal injection, cruel and unusual. A lot of people said hanging was, so we quit doing that in Idaho in 1954, I think was our last hanging. And it took 18 minutes for the guy to die. They didn't do it right. So we quit hanging, and I think we did firing squad for a while, and then in the 70s it was ruled unconstitutional. In 76 it was brought back as constitutional. I think we may even legalized the gas chamber for a while, but now it's lethal injection in Idaho. Other states have different ways. You got electric chair. Electric chair is not always foolproof. That doesn't always work the first time. Most of the time it does, but it doesn't always. Have you ever seen the movie Green Mile? Yeah. That has happened before, where you catch fire. What's that?
Isn't it because he didn't wet this one?
Yes. According to that movie, yes. But I have read accounts where people have literally just swelled up into one big blister and different stuff. I mean, it's pretty... If done right, you don't even know what's happening to you. You're immediately unconscious. But those who don't get it done right, it's pretty horrific. So we still deal with this today. Is solitary confinement cruel and unusual? Some people would argue yes. Here's a big one: the right to trial by jury of your peers, not a jury of the king's men, but of the common people. Now, keep in mind, let's say if you're a peasant farmer and you commit a crime. A peasant farmer isn't going to sit on the trial. They still have a very high class system here. But the point is, it wasn't government officials loyal to the king who was being appointed. It's going to be people of, the ideals of equal status to you.
And even today, aren't most jurors like made of like good, higher standing citizens? They aren't your just common field worker, criminal.
If you were a voter, you can be called for jury duty. So a field worker who's a registered voter, you're on the list for jury pool. So it's much more fairer now. What I find to be what makes the disadvantage of our system or this system is not all jurors are educated enough to sit on a jury and judge somebody. There's been some horrific decisions because they were just ignorant of the facts. So, but it is the best system that exists right now, and probably will be the only system. I would rather have somebody equal to my status than have a judge, and solely a judge, make a decision. In most cases. There may be some that I wouldn't. I think I'd rather use the judge on this one. But the nice thing about it, you get to choose as the defendant, whether you want a jury by trial or jury by judge, particularly when it comes to a life. There's a category of infraction that triggers that. So, and of course, the right to due process. If you're arrested, you have a right to know what it is that you're being arrested for, what you're accused of, and a right to see the evidence. If you followed any of the Bundy issues, the ranchers in Nevada and Oregon, when they went to trial, that's one of the reasons why the judge threw the case out after the third or fourth trial, because each time they found out the government was withholding evidence that ended up being favorable to the defense. That's never going to be a good thing. In fact, they will probably win a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the government because of that. And after it's either the third trial or the fourth trial, the judge was so disgusted, and she was no fan of the Bundys at all, but she was so disgusted with the prosecutors, she not only threw it out of court, but threw it out with what's called with prejudice. It means that they can never be tried for it again. So that was the judge's way of punishing the prosecutors for their misconduct and violating due process.
Advisory. It's just time management and scheduling. It should take a maximum of 2 periods.
Okay.
If you're already doing something, there's no time frame on it.
Well, this would be good because it gives me something when I run out.
And this here in the back, I'm bringing you copies, one for one of your advisory kids, so you don't have to waste any of your copies on it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. Everybody's got these provisions written down? Where have we seen these before? Our Bill of Rights. Exactly where we got those from. Because remember, our founding fathers were British. They weren't creating something new either. They're taking their heritage that they understood, that they had as natural-born Englishmen. We haven't even talked about natural law. We will when we get to the Declaration, though. I'll tie all this together to show you that these are not rights by men or given to men by men. Or another way to say it, these are not rights that came from the government. And that's very critical for you to understand. Because if government gives you these rights, what can they also do? Government being your lawmakers.
Take them away.
Take them away anytime they want.
That's why when I hear about gun control, I'm like, you realize criminals aren't going to follow those laws.
Exactly. And so all you do, and this is the argument for leaving that's anti-gun control measures, is you leave the good people without any other means of protecting themselves, which goes back to right here. Why did our founding fathers, these ancient leaders, want the provision for firearm ownership? So they could protect themselves. Again, it was not about hunting, and they weren't worried about the deer uprising.
Only the
What's that?
only the emus, but that's another emu.
Okay. With the writing and the codifying of the English Bill of Rights, it formally transforms the English government into a parliamentary monarchy. Again, this transformation occurs without a civil war, without a kinetic provision of a civil war. It was a civil war, but they were able to accomplish this without going to kinetic means. In other words, shooting. So these 4 liberty documents, this is the 4th one, gives us the foundation of what we today call American liberties. You can see they truly are not American liberties. They are clearly, looking back in history, are English liberties. That's why you will see, our founding fathers being so outraged, and they really show this well in the movie we're going to watch. How dare Parliament, or how dare the King, invade our English rights? These were very critical, especially for those who ended up moving to the New World, establishing colonies, operating under this principle, and then to have a foreign government who's never even been over here after 150 years, start telling them something different. It's getting warm.
What is cool?
I didn't turn it down very low this weekend. Too many of you were complaining about it being cold. That's my philosophy. You can always put more clothes on. All right. Again, I've already kind of started talking about this. By the end of the Glorious Revolution, there's already 8 colonies here. They know what's going on. Many of them are coming here because of what's happening in England. They understand what the king has already agreed to. It's not that he agreed to, he's recognizing formally that they have these natural rights. And out of natural rights, we're going to talk exactly what that is here in just a little bit. But out of these natural rights, they get what they refer to as their natural-born English rights. But by the 1760s, things really turned south. You'll notice in British history, about every 150 years, British history and then by extension U.S. history, about every 150 years there's another crisis that ends up climaxing with typically kinetic action and a new recognition of rights. So here we're getting ready to see the American Revolution, and then 150 years, roughly, we have the American Civil War. Except this time, with the American Civil War, when we get there, you'll see that it did not turn out as it did in the past. It's called attention getter, Brett. Give you just enough to spark your interest for what's coming in the future. By the way, I think Thursday will be our test. Yes, because I don't want to go too long into the next section. Next section, we're going to go into some pretty good detail. And I would rather have you compartmentalize this section, pre-Columbia, and our Four Liberty documents. Pre-Columbia's history, excuse me. Where do we do? We did government and Four Liberty documents, and now we're going to move into the issues of the Revolution. What led to the Revolution. I keep getting history and government mixed up on what we're doing, where we're at.
Somewhat the same.
It is. That's the problem. Ideally would be for me to teach it at the same time instead of compartmentalize the way we teach it in public school. So, all right. So let's do another review. Let's start with the Magna Carta this time. Magna Carta comes out of Stephen Langton's remembrance of the 1100 Charter of Liberties. He convinces the barons to reassert their English rights. They do so, and then further extrapolate those provisions into what's called the Magna Carta, of which we still use 3 primary provisions, and they are what? Due process, yep. We have a right to due process. What's the next one?
Oh, you have the right to challenge your detainment.
Well, that's part of the due process. What's the big one? They're all big, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that there's one bigger, but if I had to choose the one that is the biggest provision, the most profound, No. No.
Nope, it's guaranteeing of rights of people, not rights to like the common people, but to the barons.
No. You guys are getting your documents mixed up. Parliamentary government, which is another word for
The
There you go. Representative government. That's the big one out of the Magna Carta. Due process is another one. There's one more.
Taxation through reference.
There you go. No taxation without representation. So there's the three. Petition of Rights, 1628. King Charles I. He's executed for treason. After a little bit, his son, Charles II, becomes king. He prefers his head attached to his shoulders. What do we get out of it?
Taxes can only be levied by the Parliament. Martial law may not be imposed in time of peace. Prisoners must be able to challenge their detentions. Troops may not be quartered against the will of the residents. And there's provision against violation of due process.
There you go. So remember, each of these documents, one of the first things they do is reassert the previous document's provisions. So not only are we having these additional verbiages added, they are not replacing previous documents. They're adding to. Except for the Bill of Rights. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So, we don't need a whole lot of understanding the English Civil Wars other than, or the Bishop Wars. Just understand during this time period, okay, there's a lot of chaos. We even went through about a 9-year period where we were a constitutional monarchy, and then the king was King James, no, it was the second, excuse me, the second, Charles I is the one that lost his head. Charles II is reestablished on the throne, back to a monarchy. We get King James II, correct? In the Glorious Revolution, he prefers his head too to be attached. And we get the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights, what it does is it takes the languages of all of those, of the previous three documents, and rewords it more into what we'd call modern English, though it was not modern than what we would call modern. But if you read the original verbiage of these other documents, they're actually quite difficult to read, and some of the things that it talks about does not exist anymore at this time period. So they reword it and articulate it into those 15 items. Very clear and concise what these particular rights were for Englishmen. And because this was done without actually having to go to a kinetic action in a civil war, it's termed in British history as the Glorious Revolution. It was glorious because they were able to make a complete change in governmental system to a constitutional monarchy, a parliamentary monarchy, without having to go to war over it. So, putting it all together, this is what it would look like. If you want to write that in your notes so you can that way you're able to visualize from 450 AD through 1689. The key events and documents. So if I ask you to write an essay to explain the four Liberty documents, that would be like maybe the only question I would ask, because this would be probably a multi-page response. This is how you would want to write it. Each one of these things would be a paragraph, at least. A couple of them would be more. You're going to tell me a little bit about this. You're going to make your cause and effect, your relationship discussions linking to each one of these. Think of it as if you set your dominoes up on end and you go all the way around the desk here. If this is the Anglo-Saxons here and you push it over and start the clock of English history, each one of these will have a cause and effect relationship. You writing, Josh?
I got the majority of it down. I can remember the rest of it.
You can remember today, but what about tomorrow?
Check remember. I got a good memory.
You want to take that chance?
Only I can even put the rest of this on there.
Get another I got a host. I got 1,000 pages of paper over there. Don't let that be an excuse. Raquel, you got that down?
Oh, it's 100. Magna Carta, Petition of Rights, English Bill of Rights.
Yes, 1,100 Charter of Liberties, the Magna Carta of 1215, the Petition of Rights 1628, and the English Bill of Rights of 1668. What was deemed to be evil and oppressive in terms of what William II was doing? Overtaxation, not just tax. Nobody refutes the need for taxes. It is the overtaxation is the problem. Even today, most people, conservatives, Democrats, right, middle, whatever, nobody refutes the need for taxes for public services. We all want police when we call 911. We all want the ambulance to show up when we call, or the fire department. Nobody has a problem paying taxes for those kinds of, or clean water when we turn on the tap, or having a way of getting rid of our sewage. The issue that most people have is the overtaxation. So, and what was one of the things that they called over, or that they deemed to be overtaxation?
Death tax.
Yes, the inheritance tax. Something we tolerate today. They deem that to be evil and oppressive. What's that? For what?
The English Civil
The English Civil
Wars, is it?
Wars. Those are that's 1645 to 51. What are the couple provisions specifically called out, or that King Henry I agreed to in the 1100 Charter of Liberties?
The king would be subject to laws.
Yes, king and his men were subject to the laws. Yes. Why is the Battle of Hastings of 1066 important? Why did we bring that up in our class? Yes, Brett?
That's because when William became the first king of England, like he kept the system of governments from the Anglo-Saxons.
Very close. I would probably accept that as an answer. William I, King of Normandy, invades England and defeats the Anglo-Saxons in the Battle of Hastings, 1066. As a result, over time, he consolidated his power from the different regions, but kept the Anglo-Saxons' administrative system in place. Let's see here. What is significant about the Archbishop Stephen Langton?
How he went against the king.
Did he go against the king? Explain.
Oh, they disputed with the King John over who gets to appoint the bishops.
Okay, Emily, you got anything to add? Say again? Nope, wrong one. That's Henry VIII. So Brett he's on it. It's Stephen Langton is the one that reminds, that is the question, right? Stephen Langton? For a minute, my brain just shut down.
He reminds the barons of their rights, and he was disputing with King John over who gets to appoint their.
That's right. Stephen Langton reminded the barons of the rights the previous kings had agreed to and encouraged them to stand up for them, to exercise them. And yes, the dispute that he had was that really what it came down to his own job. The Pope wanted Stephen Langton to be the bishop in England, the Archbishop in England, which is the Pope, at that time, the Pope's job to appoint. The king, however, did not like him and wanted his own archbishop. That's what it came down to. So there was a personal stake in this whole thing. Absolutely. Not just the archbishop. He wanted to appoint all the bishops, but particularly the archbishop is the most powerful. Even today in England, he's the most powerful clergy in England, still today. The only difference is he's not Catholic. He's a member of the Church of England. The Church of England, excuse me. The Anglican Church is the American version. All right. So, again, another review. The 4 Liberty documents, I will ask you to identify them. If it's essay, I'm going to ask you list or tell me identify the 4 Liberty documents. You're going to write in complete sentence. The 4 Liberty documents are 1100 Charter of Liberties, the Magna Carta of 1215, the Petition of Right of 1628, and the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Period, full stop, answer, 100 points. Whatever it's worth, I don't know. I may have a list of documents, if I do a multiple choice type matching kind of setup, then I may give you a list of documents that you will choose from, and you will identify them. Or I might even make it true-false. Do any of these documents apply to you today? Caitlin? How? That's right. It's part of your inheritance for being an American citizen. When our Supreme Court, when they rule from an originalist perspective, they often will go back and cite the historical foundations of these documents as part of the interpretation of our own Constitution. You will probably see more and more of it with the, particularly if Judge Kavanaugh is approved to the U.S. Supreme Court, which it's anticipated he will be this fall. So, the 1100 Charter of Liberties. Key points for you to remember here. So we're summarizing or reviewing and summarizing everything that we've said. It's a written mode of government. The king was subject to the law and declared overtaxation, corruption, and oppressive rule as oppressive and evil. If I ask you what's the significance of 1100 Charter of Liberties, there you go. Again, this is easy to make it a multiple choice or true, false, or matching. Or if it's an essay, you just simply would answer the question in complete sentence. So I'm giving you answers, telling you test questions. Do you think I'm going to be lenient on test day? Nope. I'm spoon feeding you. Judgment day is coming. I've did my job. Now it's your turn to do yours. Yep. When I see all pencils down, then I'll know we're done writing, and we can move on to the next one. We'll get there. Magna Carta. The key points out of this document. Why do we distinguish the date on this document in particular? That's true, but there are more than one Magna Cartas. This is the first and most important. Again, remember, we're being simplistic in this class because we can't cover all the details. It wasn't like once this document got signed and everything got quiet until 150 years later and then it got crazy again. This has been an ongoing, continual battle for liberty for 918 years. And still today. It's not any more resolved today. Remember, President Reagan, I said this, last Thursday or Friday, President Reagan said, our freedom is only one generation away from being gone. Every generation must reassert their liberties. And if you don't, libido dominante will continue to take over in our governmental systems. It's just as natural as us breathing. If you don't push back, in fact, a lot of those in Congress, they're on video saying this. We'll do what we want to do. We know it's unconstitutional, but we wait until it's challenged in the courts. And until then, you have to do what it says to do. I'll have to find some video on that where some congressmen openly admit that most of what they do is unconstitutional, but nobody's willing to challenge it to the Supreme Court. What's that? Yeah. Totally reversed in how our constitutional republic was established. When we take our trip to the State House and Representative Christy Zito talked to us, she'll talk to you about the immense power that when she's in there, she feels just hanging on her shoulders of controlling individual people's lives. She has the power to make laws that can destroy or uplift people just by her vote. And she's got a story that I always ask her to tell our students of what was said to her, that you made these campaign promises, but when you get here, you'll realize this power is it's kind of nice to take that drink. And she said it's quite scary how quick people are to change when they walk into that building. I can only imagine how much more that power attraction occurs in Washington, D.C., where you have the highest offices in the world. That's where the real liberty comes into play. If you don't have morality to recognize you could do horrendous damage by your position, you'll do whatever you want to do to benefit yourself. Look at how many people come out multimillionaires out of Washington, D.C. when they come in originally with sometimes without 2 pennies to rub together.
Professional politicians
Yeah.
who shouldn't be paid.
Well, originally in our system, you didn't get paid. The federal government did not pay for offices. The states would determine how much you were paid for your position.
John Adams is a farmer and so is Washington.
Yep. They didn't make any money as government officials. Yep, they supported themselves. And I think by doing so, they were able to keep themselves pretty honest.
Yeah, that's how you fix a lot of the corruption today.
That's right. That was one of the appeals to President Trump. Is he's not beholden, and still isn't beholden, to donors.
Yeah, he gave all his money away.
Yeah, every time president gets paid quarterly, he donates his money to a charity each time. This last time he donated to the Veterans Administration. So it's really hard. The establishment don't like him. It's one of the reasons they don't like him. There's many reasons, but one of the reasons is because he doesn't play by their rules. And if they can't control you, they're going to...
Well, if you legally have to be paid at $1.
Yes. Yeah. But he does take the money, but he donates it. So he does not... it's in the news every time he does. It's not like it's propaganda, but he's kept his word to that.
I wouldn't be surprised if something like what happened to JFK happens.
There are some people that is worried about that. With the more that's been exposed in the so-called Russiagate scandal, the more that it makes the conspiracy theories of JFK and CIA taking him out a little more plausible. I've been to Daley Plaza. I've stood on, they've got an X right in the street where he was shot. I've been up, you can't stand in the window where Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly shot, but you can stand next to it. They've got it kind of glassed off, set up the way it originally was. Looking down at the street, looking back up at the window, I don't believe he shot 3 times and hit him twice. I personally don't. I've stood at the grassy knoll at the spot where the ideal that the other shooter was. That is much more plausible. But I don't doubt that he was one of the shooters. Why, I don't know. But there's more to that story. And I know a little bit about ballistics and the way that head shoots back when he was hit in the head. That's not a back shot.
Isn't it definitely exploded?
Pretty much. I've seen pictures of what was left. Yeah, pretty much. It's very interesting, but that's the problem with not having a transparent government. Is when you don't have a transparent government, then all these other ideals come out in order, because if you don't have answers for the unexplainable, human nature is you're going to create answers, even if they are far-fetched. Yeah, human nature is we have to have answers. That's why we're always searching for, like, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of our existence? And that has been a search from the beginning of time. All the ancient philosophers have discussed what's the purpose, what's the meaning of man. And there's a void in human nature without an answer to that. That's why people are seeking those answers in every which way. Weird cults and drugs and alcohol. I mean, people are searching for that answer. So same thing with JFK and any other. So when you see how powerful the CIA is, and these other clandestine government departments, you can see why people come up with those concerns. Who's really running this show, kind of thing. So I don't know. I'm not trying to promote one view or the other. I'm just saying I most certainly can understand those concerns. So basic constitution charters are based on the Magna Carta today. Established parliamentary government, we call that today representative government. Let's see, the king was subject to the law of the land. Again, that's not unique, but they're reiterating this fact. Taxation through representation and due process rights. Part of the due process rights we'll see here a little bit is from habeas corpus. Again, that's your right to know what you're being detained for. With the FISA court, I can't remember what FISA stands for now, the federal, I'll have to look it up, but it's our spy court, if you will, when the FBI, CIA, those groups are spying on individuals, they, particularly the ideal that they're terrorist organizations, then they can go to this FISA court, which is totally secret, and be arrested and never know why you're being arrested. They can detain you permanently without ever having due process. And that has been, especially for the libertarian senators like Rand Paul, Ron Paul, and others, Massey from Kentucky, they've been fighting this provision in the Patriot Act because of this right here, due process. So, petition a right. Sets forth specific protected liberties of the monarch's subjects. Taxes can only be levied by Parliament. So in other words, no hunting and fishing license unless Parliament agrees. That's one of the reasons why our state representatives are the ones that gets to approve increases in our hunting and fishing license. The Fish and Game here in Idaho is not a government agency, but our state legislators provide oversight. And they cannot raise the license fees without representative government approving it. Kind of like the post office. The post office is not a government agency. It's a private agency. But with oversight of Congress. They can't raise the stamp fee without Congress's approval. But they run it like a government, and that's why they're always millions or billions in debt every year. It's a bizarre organization the way it's set up. Prisoners must be able to detain or must be able to challenge the detentions. Cannot house troops in private homes without permission. And provisions that against violation of due process rights.